Αγαπητές φίλοι και φίλοι, καλησπέρα σας. Είναι η τελευταία εκδήλωση η οποία φιλοξενείται στο πλαίσιο του 27ου Πανελληνίου Συνεδρίου Ακαδημαϊκών Βιβλιοθηκών. Είναι μια εκδήλωση από αυτές που ονομάζουν τις δορυφορικές. Είναι δηλαδή, περιφέρονται δίπλα από το κυρίω σώμα του συνεδρίου, το οποίο ήταν Δευτέρα, Τετάρτη και Τετάρτη. Παρ' όλα αυτά, είναι εκδηλώσεις στις οποίες δίνουμε την ίδια σημασία, γιατί μας ενδιαφέρει να προκύψουν χρήσιμα συμπεράσματα όχι μόνο για τους άμεσα ενδιαφερόμενους, που στη συγκεκριμένη περίπτωση είναι το δίκτυο οικονομικών βιβλιοθηκών, αλλά επειδή σε αυτά τα δίκτυα τα οποία προσκαλέσαμε στο συνέδριο συμμετέχουν πάρα πολλές ακαδημαϊκές βιβλιοθήκες, νομίζω αγγίζουν όλες τις ακαδημαϊκές βιβλιοθήκες, άλλες περισσότερες, άλλες λιγότερο, γιατί τα πανεπιστήμια μας έχουν καταλήξει να είναι διαθεματικά, διεπιστημονικά, οπότε υπάρχουν σχολές σχεδόν σε όλα τα ιδρύματα και προφανώς υπάρχουν πανεπιστημιακές, ακαδημαϊκές βιβλιοθήκες που είναι πιο προηγμένες και πιο εξελιγμένες σε ορισμένους τομείς, αλλά και οι υπόλοιποι μπορούμε να μάθουμε δίπλα τους και από την εμπειρία τους που έχουν αποκομίσει από τα δίκτυα, από τις συνεργασίες όλων αυτών των ετών και ούτω καθεξής. Άρα, θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω πάρα πολύ το Δίκτυο Οικονομικών Βιβλιοθηκών, την Χριστίνα Τελειόγλου, την Αθήνα Κατσιρίκου και την υπόλοιπη ομάδα, η οποία ενδιαφέρθηκε και συζητήσαμε και συνεργαστήκαμε για να έχουμε αυτή την εκδήλωση σήμερα. Και είναι πολύ μεγάλη χαρά και τιμή και ελπίζουμε ότι θα υπάρξουν χρήσιμα συμπεράσματα για όλους. Οπότε, από μένα έχουμε καλές εργασίες στο συγκεκριμένο workshop, όπως θα λέγαμε, το οποίο έχει δύο ξένες ομιλήτριες και ο λόγος στη Χριστίνα, την προϊσταμένη της Βιβλιοθήκης και την πληροφόρηση του Οικονομικού Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών, για τη δική της εισαγωγή.
Καλησπέρα και από μένα. Ευχαριστώ πολύ, Γιάννη. Ευχαριστώ όλους σας που βρίσκεστε σε αυτή τη τελευταία, ας το πούμε, συνεδρία, εκδήλωση του συνεδρίου. Όπως προλόγησε και ο Γιάννης, πρόκειται για μια εκδήλωση του Δικτύου Οικονομικών Βιβλιοθηκών, το οποίο αποτελείται από 10 βιβλιοθήκες μέλη με κοινό παρονομαστή τις συλλογές οικονομικού περιεχομένου που διαθέτουν οι βιβλιοθήκες αυτές, το οποίο ιδρύθηκε το 2012. Είχε την ιδέα να προσκαλέσει αυτές τις κυρίες, τις δύο ομιλήτρες που θα σας παρουσιάσω σε λίγο, στο πλαίσιο των δορυφορικών εκδηλώσεων του 27ου Πανελληνίου Συνεδρίου Ακαδημαϊκών Βιβλιοθηκών, οι οποίες θα μας παρουσιάσουν τα νέα πρότυπα που θέτουν οι διεθνείς οργανισμοί πιστοποίησης εκπαιδευτικών φορέων, τα οποία συνεπάγονται νέες απαιτήσεις από το επάγγελμά μας εντός ενός πιστοποιημένου φορέα από διεθνή οργανισμό πιστοποίησης. Η αναζήτηση χρηματοδότησης από τα πανεπιστήμια εξαιτίας και του νέου κανονιστικού πλαισίου στην ανώτατη εκπαίδευση ενδεχομένως θα οδηγήσει τα πανεπιστήμια σε αναζήτηση λύσεων διεθνούς πιστοποίησης, οι οποίες αναμένεται να επηρεάσουν αναπόφευκτα τις απαιτήσεις αποδοτικότητας των βιβλιοθηκών εντός των φορέων τους. Το Association του Advanced Collegiate Schools of Business, το οποίο πιστοποιεί πάνω από 530 σχολές διοίκησης επιχειρήσεων μόνο στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες, κυκλοφόρησε το 2012 ένα νέο έγγραφο πιστοποίησης των σχολών διοίκησης επιχειρήσεων. Στην απόψινή μας εκδήλωση, οι ομιλήτριές μας θα παρουσιάσουν συντομία τις νέες τάσεις, δείχνοντας αναδρομικά τη σχετικότητα της βιβλιοθήκης με τα νέα πρότυπα και μία επισκόπηση στην ανάπτυξη νέων προτύπων πιστοποίησης για τις σχολές διοίκησης επιχειρήσεων. Θα επικεντρωθούν στα σημεία των προτύπων αυτών, στα οποία οι βιβλιοθηκονόμοι μπορούν να διαδραματίσουν σημαντικό ρόλο, δίνοντας ένα πιθανό σχεδιάγραμμα για τους τρόπους που μπορούν να συνδυάσουν τα σεμινάρια πληροφοριακού γραμματισμού με τους εκπαιδευτικούς στόχους της ακαδημαϊκής κοινότητας, συνεισφέροντας και διαμορφώνοντας το πρόγραμμα σπουδών. Στο τέλος της ομιλίας θα υπάρχει ευκαιρία να τεθούν ερωτήσεις και απορίες προς τις ομιλήτριες, τις οποίες παρακαλώ να απευθύνετε στο chat της εφαρμογής Zoom. Θα μου επιτρέψετε τώρα να συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά και να προλογίσω τις κυρίες. Please let me introduce our tonight's speakers, Mrs. Ilana Stonebraker and Mrs. LuMarie Guth. Mrs. Ilana Stonebraker joined Indiana University Libraries as Head of Business SPEA Information Commons and Associate Librarian in 2020. In her role at Indiana University, Ilana serves as the primary contact and library liaison to faculty, students, and staff of the Kelley School of Business and the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, with a staff who provides core services such as instruction, reference, circulation, and research. She also serves as the subject specialist for economics. She has published 14 peer-reviewed scholarly journal articles, 3 book chapters, 6 conference papers, and presented at over 35 major conferences. Ilana was recognized as the ALA Library Instruction Roundtable as an author of one of the top 20 library instruction articles of 2017 and 2016. Her work has been recognized through several awards. Her area of research includes business information, critical information, literacy, and crowdsourcing. Mrs. LuMarie Guth is a business librarian and associate professor at Western Michigan University. She's past chair of the Brass Business Education Committee. She has published on the incorporation of the framework for information literacy for higher education into library instruction and its implication for business instruction in particular. LuMarie's paper on faculty views of the framework was selected as one of the top 20 library instruction articles of 2018. Her research is in the area of library instruction and especially in the application of information literacy standards. So Ilana and LuMarie have already gave a framework of your presentation in Greek. So we're ready to listen to you. We are all ears and the digital floor is all yours. After your presentation, there will be some questions which you might be kind enough to answer. So the floor is yours.
We would love to. Thank you so much for inviting us today. It's so great to be part of the Panhellenic Librarians Conference, Academic Library Conference today. Thank you for taking the time out of your Friday night to come and visit us here in the US. We were very pleased to be talking to you guys about this topic. This is something that me and LuMarie are very excited about, very excited to share with you guys today. So once again, my name is Ilana Stonebraker. I'm at Indiana University Bloomington, which is specifically a 40,000 student campus located in Indiana in the US. LuMarie Guth is at Western Michigan University, which is a smaller regional campus also located in the Midwest in Michigan. So just to give you an agenda of what we're going to be covering today, we're going to talk about AACSB Accreditation, which is the major accreditor for business schools, and specifically why they are important, particularly for those who work with business, economics, commerce schools across the world. To do that, we're going to be doing a retrospective of the libraries and the standards. This is intended to give you an idea of what the standards have met over time, so you can better understand the changes that came out in 2020 and 2021. We're going to do an overview of the 2020 drafting process, as well as an analysis of what the 2020 standards and the 2021 update mean for libraries. We're also going to give some insight into what what we believe librarians can do right now in response to these standards as we go. So just a couple of quick kind of housekeeping levels. One thing I'm going to put in the chat here is a link to a guide that we're going to be referencing throughout the presentation. This guide is actually a toolkit for people who are working with AACSB. And this was created as part of the American Libraries Association Business Reference and Services section that we've sort of created. I'm a past chair of the ALA Brass Committee, as well as you heard that LuMarie was chair of the education. We're also going to save questions until the end. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, as well as we'll leave some time right at the end for that. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to LuMarie, who's going to talk a little bit more about AACSB.
Thank you. So AACSB International is the accreditation institution that accredits most of the business programs in the world. So they were established in 1916 and in the 90s transitioned into a more global role. So they first established and were accrediting institutions in the United States and transitioned in the 19s to AACSB International. And today after the initial accreditation process, they have a continuous improvement process where schools they renew their accreditation every 5 years and have to submit a continuous review report. If we look at AACSB presence in the EU, there are currently 85 schools in 15 of the 27 EU member states that are AACSB accredited. In addition to those that are accredited, there's also the educational members. So these are people who are able to get discounted rates at the conferences and get access to the resources and the network at AACSB, but they don't have the formal accreditation. And that includes 146 schools in 26 of the 27 EU member countries. Some other accreditors that accredit internationally include the Accreditation Council for Business Schools and Programs and the International Accreditation Council for Business Education. Both of these have a presence in the European Union, but it's much smaller than that of AACSB. So looking at why do we care about the standards? So when talking about the standards with faculty administrators at my college, it's useful to show that librarians care and are staying informed on the standards that are being used to judge and accredit the curriculum at the business school. So within librarianship, we have our own professional guidelines that we adhere to. But as subject librarians, as business specialists in the library, where by keeping up with the standards, we're keeping up with the expectations of the faculty and the curriculum at the schools that we serve. I also use the standards quite frequently to find areas for value in library instruction. So trying to find places in the standards that can be used for creating instructional outcomes for information literacy instruction and using as a rationale for expanding library services. I like to review the standards and look for opportunities to support the programs at the business school with library services. And so we'll be looking at several areas for opportunity today. So let's take into account the retrospective of how libraries have been engaged with the standards. So as far back as we were able to look, we could access the 1991-1994 revision online, which makes sense if you think about when the internet started becoming really popular. We were able to start accessing the standards as of 1994. And in that version of the standards, we found language that the schools must augment library resources, databases, and information technology appropriately to support those mission elements. Now, I found this especially interesting, especially the use of the word augmenting library resources, which to me indicates some sort of support financially of the library collections. So the standards change about every 8 to 10 years. So there was the 1991 version of the standards, and in that standards, actually, there was additional library language on library and instructional and information technology, which is probably one of the first points that technology made an entry into the standards when you see the expansion of computers in libraries in the 90s. And additionally, monitoring usage of library and other information resources in course assignments and in student activities. So the libraries were specifically referenced in the 1991 AACSB standards 3 times under support for the library, technology, and in resources and support for the curriculum. The next update to the standards, we went from 1991 to 2003. And in the 2003 version, there was only one specific reference to the library, and that was in the section specifying that you need to describe faculty development, including instructional enhancement, library and other information access, technology assistance, and support for faculty intellectual contributions. So a lot of the terminology around the collections has been removed from the 2003 standards. So now we're focusing on supporting instruction and supporting faculty intellectual contributions. 2013, there was a complete removal of specific mentions of libraries in the standards. So instead, librarians turned to areas of the curriculum and looked for keywords that were familiar to the terminology they use in describing information literacy. And so some of those keywords that we were able to find in the curriculum was analytical thinking, so the ability to analyze and frame problems, mentions of markets, and evidence-based decision-making. So all of these are familiar concepts to what we deal with in teaching information literacy. And this is what business librarians used when trying to tie their work into the standards. So some observations that we found from looking at 1991, the 90s, and shifting 25 years later into 2013. So we could see the major shift in computing and the increase in technology in the standards. In 2003, there was no mention of print-related services, and that was mentioned in 1991, the 1994 version. In addition to the switch over to computing, we were able to find that the library presence in the standards went from having a full paragraph section to one of being mentioned as one of multiple support services, and then in 2003 to not being referenced at all. So the effect of the standards on business librarians, we saw, I think that some of this can be attributed to general shifts in the library profession as a whole. But some of this may also tie into what we were seeing happening in shifts in business curriculum through the standards. So there was a shift from collections to instruction. So there was less focus on how many things people subscribe to, making sure that they subscribe to specific journals, but instead focusing on what types of instructional support services can we provide. There was supporting forces from AACSB, including the addition of assurance of learning in the 2003 standards. So we're now assessing learning and the globalization of AACSB and outreach to more business schools. And this makes sense when you think about AACSB as an international organization. It's no longer just focused on large universities in the United States, but including smaller size institutions and institutions all over the world. So instead of creating a list of collection content items that every library needs to subscribe to, it makes much more sense to kind of leave that more generalized and ask the institutions to describe how they're supporting the curriculum within the context of their specific institution. Supporting forces from within librarianship include things like the serials crisis, which is the inflation of the prices of serials or journals over the last several decades, beyond the raise of the cost of living, and online databases, and a release of the ACRL standards in 2000s. This is the information literacy standards that are, I think, were used in Canada and the United States and maybe used in other countries around the world, that's focusing more on the instructional role of librarianship. With that, I will turn it over to Ilana and let her share my screen.
Thanks, LuMarie. So what I'm going to talk about next is the 2020 standards. So as we mentioned, about every 8 to 10 years, there's a new standard for how we accredit or look at business schools. And in 2020, this was when the standards happened. So me and LuMarie both looked at retrospective in terms of the standards, but we also tracked what the 2020 standards look like as they were unfolding over 2020. This ended up being very easy because of the global pandemic. A lot of the meetings were streamed during this period, so it was a little bit more of an open process than it had been in 2013. So we could see things happen in real time, often at the main conferences for AACSB, and kind of see how things were happening. Now, in order to understand that, we're actually going to have to go a little bit further back. So we're going to look at the Collective Vision for Business Education, which was first released in 2016 and has a lot of themes that are really important in the AACSB standards for business schools. First, the catalyst for innovation, being focused on innovative focus. That's things like entrepreneurship. Being a hub of lifelong learning, this fits into a lot of things that libraries do, but a lot of things that business schools in general. Being a co-creator of knowledge, so focusing a lot on the faculty and their research and how they create knowledge. Leader, also a faculty related one, the leaders on leadership. So being AACSB is focusing itself as being a center for management science, as well as enablers of global prosperity. So how do business schools show that they affect the economies of the countries and cities and places in which they work? So specifically, that collective vision was released at the International Conference and Annual Meeting of AACSB, and it has many of the concepts that included in the 2020 standards. So if you're looking into this resource, I do suggest that that's a great place to get started. So in 2018 as well, the Business Accreditation Task Force was first focused on reimagining business accreditation. So this was a task force committee that the AACSB put together that then formulated what became the standards. The process looked a bit like this. There was the first exposure draft, one of 3 drafts in September 2019. The final proposed standards were adopted in April 2020. And after a revision, this was the 3rd revision. And then there was an update to the standards after a pilot group of schools this last July, so July 2021. So those are the kind of big areas to think about as we look at the standards. So the initial 2020 release, all the drafts were made available on the AAC website. There were comment periods after every single point, as well as a virtual voting period. And it's really great because they made recordings of it, so we can kind of hear how people were responding to it and where it kind of went from there, as well as we can see the changes that happened in 2021. So without further ado, we're going to look at how those 2020 standards focused, and specifically how they looked in comparison to previous versions of the standard. Okay. So just to go through a collective vision, there's the 2020 standards. And one of the things that happened is that the 2020 business standards split into 2 different documents. The business standards themselves, what looks very similar to what we've experienced in the past, and a new document called the interpretive guidance. And when we originally saw the interpretive guidance, we thought that it would be updated more regularly, but I think it's actually meant to sort of give more information about what is happening specifically in those, so that when they get a site visit, business schools have an idea of what to expect. So here are the main focused areas. And for those who work with business education, many of these are things that are major trends in business schools. And so you'll see over and over again. So we'll see some of the guiding principles are ethics and integrity, big in business schools, societal impact, which LuMarie will talk in depth later, peer review, which is the idea of site visits and business schools which accredit each other as peer review. There's a focus on continuous improvement, collegiality, and agility, so does the school work together? A global mindset, as you can see, the AACSB accreditation is very globally focused. So how do you affect both your local and your global area? Diversity and inclusion is embedded throughout the document and the updates, as well as continued adherence to, which obviously is kind of silly because it's principles that adhere to itself, but those are the main focuses. So in understanding the documents, one thing to keep in mind is that standards are made up of 4 pieces. First, there's the description of the standard itself, which is sort of the high level, this is what we think a business school ought to be. Then there's a definition of terms. So for example, when we say faculty, what do we mean? When we say staff, when we say learners, what do we mean when we say that? Then there's the basis of judgment, which is basically, this is how we think you can show us that you meet this aspirational goal that business schools should have, and then suggested documentation. So this is what we think we evaluate you on, and this is how you're going to show it specifically, which is really important because these standards are often about being accredited, right? So the biggest and most important thing that happened in the 2020 standards, which is why we're very excited about the 2020 standards. I like to make the joke that the AACSB standards are the best thing to happen to business librarians in 2020, right? So it's great news. So librarians and library support have returned to these standards. The first spot is in the physical, virtual, and financial resources in the definition. So what we see is that the actual standard is the school manages its physical, virtual, and financial resources to sustain the school on an ongoing basis. And then you'll see physical resources. So this is the definition, include buildings, furniture, fixtures, technology labs, collaboration. And then it's interesting because it says including virtual libraries, right? So there's this nod to the services part of what we do. And then other physical infrastructure focused as well. Additionally, they're mentioned as a basis in Standard 3, the faculty and professional staff resources. So they describe the professional staff structure with respect to, and here's a litany of different departments: advising, career placement, IT support, faculty instructional support, library support, that's where the librarians come in, and faculty research support. So identify which resources are centralized and which are supported at a university level. So this is doubly good in that, first of all, it acknowledges that librarians directly affect faculty success, but it also acknowledges that some of these changes are going to be at the local level, the business school level, and some of them are going to be part of central libraries. So a lot of us, particularly I'm at a Big 10 large campus, our libraries are centralized and not necessarily paid for from the business school. So this was very good news because previously I might not have been included because I wasn't part of the business school part of that curriculum, right? So this is very exciting. So I kind of do a little dance here. So there's not one, but two different mentions, both as a space, so the physical library space, and the virtual resources, but also a description of an acknowledgement that librarians are important as staff themselves, and then the relationship is both inside and outside of the departments that we're looking at. So, and so that's the big change. But I do think there's other changes that I think librarians need to know about. One is the emphasis on storytelling. So this is from AACSB International at ICANN, and they say, importantly, these standards move us to principles-based and outcome-focused. This is very different than the standards we've been using, and it's focused on inputs and quality of inputs. We'll still have some of that, but they're much more principles-based. So what does that mean? That means that previously, the schools spent a lot of time drudging through data, trying to find the exact types of data that would meet specific tables that the university was required to do by AACSB. What it tries to do in the new 2020 standards is it says, you tell me what is important to your business school's mission, and then tell that story to us. So we're giving you a lot more leverage to say, this is important to us, this is what we need, and this is what we think you can do with it. So in that way, it is aspirationally, at least, trying to be a very different type of document. Now, additionally, I wanted to talk about words that were specifically included in the 2020 standards that we thought were particularly important. And I'm just going to get my notes out here. So one of them, and the big one, is societal impact. I mentioned that societal impact is named for one of their guiding principles, but it's also mentioned throughout the document. So I have here that it's mentioned 47 times in the document specifically. Learners is the new word for any students. The way they say it is that learners learn and students study. So learners is a more inclusive term. And that learners is mentioned 35 times in the document. So if you hear from the business school that they're not talking about learners versus students, it has to do with that cultural change. Lifelong learning, which is very important to librarians. Lifelong learning is mentioned 12 times. throughout the document, as well as mission-driven is mentioned many times. What is missing in this new document is corporate social responsibility, which was a big focus of the previous standards and has been replaced by the much larger societal impact term, which obviously allows people to not only be showing kind of CSR, corporate social responsibility as a firm, but also a nod to local ethics and compliance, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to LuMarie, who's going to talk a little bit more about societal impact.
Thank you. So on this slide, I have some of the language around societal impact, giving a bit of a definition from the standard. So what's interesting is that not only is societal impact present in the standards, but it was given its own standard. So it's become one of the major focuses of the 2020 document in the accreditation process. So what's very interesting about societal impact is not only is it more inclusive than corporate social responsibility, but for the first year, it was left to be kind of very broad for the schools to define themselves. After that first year, though, they did decide to add some structure in how to report societal impact. And in doing that, they chose to link it to, apologies. This is just a response from one of the business deans that was at the conference announcing the final version of the standards. And I'm really thanking them for Standard 9 for this increased focus on societal impact and how they can show their value through that. In my discussions with faculty in my institution, one of the perspectives was that perhaps societal impact was actually a grassroots driven concept that came out of the students. For the last several years, we've been seeing that we'll give students a business assignment and they'll want to take a sustainability focus with it. Societal impact is something that has been a long time coming, and everyone's very happy to see it become part of the standards. So after that first year of leaving societal impact basically undefined in how to report it, they instead decided to, in 2021, to link societal impact to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So they actually provide a sample table where they have a row for each of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and ask institutions in their report to describe how they fulfilled individual goals. So here's an example from one of those tables. So this is for the no poverty Sustainable Development Goal. And you can see they're showing how the social impact, asking for outcomes related to curriculum, scholarship, and internal and external initiatives or activities. So this is getting very specifically attached to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, an area that, and we're already seeing in our schools and in talks with other business librarians that our business schools are already setting up centers for UN Sustainable Development Goals or specific courses or other programs or initiatives around this. So this is something that schools are jumping onto. Another topic that was brought up that we talked about before was lifelong learning. And this is something that librarians in both the academic and public library spheres have been focused on for many, many years. So that one place that they talk about lifelong learning actually is in teaching effectiveness and impact, where they talk about how to ask to describe how faculty demonstrate a lifelong learning mindset. And this is very interesting because not only are we thinking about the students as learners, the students who we traditionally think of as learners, but the 2020 standards is expanding the concept of learning to the faculty and the instructors. So asking faculty to describe how they're engaging in a lifelong learning mindset through things like professional development or engagement in research on the scholarship of teaching and learning. Another concept that proves an area for opportunity with libraries is microlearning. Some people have seen microlearning described in terms of like badge programs or certificate programs. Microlearning is defined in standard 5.3 as stackable or otherwise able to be combined into an AACSB accredited degree program. to ensure processes, to ensure high quality and continuous improvement. Some other examples of microlearning may be use of outside instruction. So things like massive online courses or MOOCs, or instruction that's brought in through other resources like LinkedIn or other available instruction outside of the university. So AACSB is legitimizing these types of experiences in order to add to credentials alongside courses that are taught traditionally through the university. Where we see an opportunity with this for libraries especially is through things like workshop programs, tutorials, any involvement that libraries can have in certificate programs or any other sort of curriculum programs or even extracurricular programs where people are learning soft skills outside of the traditional coursework. Speaking of soft skills, an additional area for opportunity is in standard 4.1. So this is saying the schools deliver content that is current, relevant, forward-thinking, globally oriented, and aligned with program competency goals and consistent with its mission, strategies, and expected outcomes. So when we look at how 4.1 can actually manifest, this is in the assurance of learning section where they're asking us to measure competency goals as described in 4.1. And you can see that some of the competencies here are all soft skills. So things like oral communication skills, written communication skills, technical business knowledge. And, you know, there's an opportunity here to include information literacy or secondary market research or other ways that we can describe the type of skills that we teach in this table. So table 5.1 is left undefined. You can choose to define the competencies in whatever ways that work best for the mission of your institution. So this is another place where the libraries can include what they teach and integrate it into the curriculum and reporting for the tables for the AACSB report. So another thing that I'd like to talk about is the initial accreditation. So thus far, we've talked about things that have to be done during the continuous review and the initial accreditation. But when schools first become accredited by AACSB, there are some additional requirements that they have to meet just that first time in the initial review. And some of those are related to the library. So the language that I have on this slide, I took from the initial business accreditation handbook for the 2020 standards. And the link is provided. It's on the AACSB website. And they ask for additional records from the library. And some of the things they ask for are usage statistics of the library and the computer technology. And they also ask for information on professional staff from facilities such as the libraries. So we found that some schools that are going through the initial accreditation process are asked for specific statistics on things like usage, computers. Some have even told us that they've asked for statistics on collections. So when your school first becomes accredited, there will be that initial demand from libraries for these amounts of data. But after that, you'll be able to focus more on areas of the other areas of the standards, such as microlearning and social impact. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ilana.
Thanks, LuMarie. So what I'm going to focus on next is what we think librarians should do now based on kind of what we found. The intent of this is to go through AACSB accreditation, understand maybe some of the history and the culture involving AACSB in order to see what librarians should do with that information, because we are not part of AACSB. AACSB is mostly towards that business school focus, looking at how you accredit and how you look at faculty research. We're focused more on the library. So we tried to think of things that we thought librarians could do with the information that we found. And this could be whether you work with a currently accredited school, a school that's going to be accredited, or just a school that might overlap with a business school as well. It may also be useful if you work, for example, for a bank library and you are looking at what is coming out of business schools. So one thing is that librarians should be focused on the mission. AACSB focuses on the mission of the school. So one thing that to figure out is, does your school have a mission statement? And make sure that you understand that statement and see how the library fits in. Additionally, think about what metrics does the business school use to tell their story. So how do they talk about their mission and how they fulfill it? Does your business school have a strategic plan? And is the library connected to that strategic plan? How does the library's mission connect to the overall mission of that business school? An example of some of the metrics that you might collect is, for example, you might collect information on how much you spend on business schools, for example, on business resources, how many books you buy. That's something that could be useful for accreditation. You might also look at how much square footage you have in a library space. That could be useful. The number of books that you have, the number of staff you have, all those metrics are helpful in the accreditation process. Additionally, you should find out if your business school is currently trying to get accredited or getting re-accredited. Knowing that could be helpful because it's generally a lot of gathering of data. So knowing that they're about to embark on that sort of, or are trying to become accredited, means that you should probably focus specifically on, knowing that you should start looking for data now, even if they haven't asked for it yet, because you will probably at some point be asked to create that data, and having some amount of talk about what you want to say, how you want to tell your story can be helpful to your other initiatives. So towards that point, we ask, how can your business school tell your story? So tell the story of the library. So what do you tell students in library instruction? So when you talk about the value of the library to business students, how do you talk about it? As an example, I talk about it in terms of how much money the library spends, right? So I will say the library, the Indiana University Library, spends $6 million a year on resources, right? I might also talk about how we go into many different classes. So for example, we went into 94 sessions this fall for various different classes. That is how I kind of talk about my library. And then what data do you collect for your administrators that you can give to administrators? So I collect the number of reference questions. I collect the number of people who walk through our library doors. Those are things that can be useful in accreditation. Also, towards that micro-credentialing, do you teach workshops that could quote unquote stack? So that could become, that maybe are part of a certificate program or some sort of other credentialing. That's good to be aware of because those were previously outside of AACSB accreditation, and now they're part of AACSB accreditation. So that might change that might lead to more resources for those workshops, or you can kind of angle them into these programs in a lot of different ways that could be helpful. So this is an example, and I've actually sent this email. And I think LuMarie has also sent a version of this email that's available on the guide.
Yes, it was very well received.
Yeah. So this is an email that I sent to the dean of my library, and LuMarie sent to the dean of her library, that says, basically, I saw that the AACSB standards were approved last summer. While we're in the proceeding of transition, here are some things that I saw in the standards, and I also noticed that might be useful. So some things that you might say is that, like, good news, I see micro-learning is included. Good news for our programs, maybe if you offer a workshop series. The focus on societal impact is really applicable, especially considering some of the new things we've acquired, right? And then also, I'm also noticing that the libraries are now mentioned in standard 2 and 3. And here's some things that we could provide. And this is, so the point of this email would be like, I, of the library, am paying attention to something that's important to you. Here is some resources that I can give for you for this project. And this has been a pretty good way of of working with the AACSB 2022 standards. Additionally, we've created this resource guide that specifically is focused on providing a toolkit for people that are interested in AACSB. So we have things like the ways to follow AACSB, so their YouTube channel, their Twitter. We have some sample outreach materials, including what I just showed, and also an email to a faculty member that you work with, as well as some ideas on past AACSB standards, and some of the ways that we're hoping to keep this up and use this as a central hub for people to put things like tables they've participated in, to share experiences. We've hosted a couple of lightning talks on different topics as part of ALA. And so we're hoping to kind of continually help librarians interact with the standards. So how can you learn more? Particularly, you can follow AACSB on social media. You can watch for changes in interpretive guidance in 2021, 2022. We've already seen changes in the 2021 area, and I would expect that there will be continual changes. There is a newsletter you can subscribe to that comes out from AACSB. So that can be helpful for sort of keeping involved. One thing that I would also pay attention to that isn't on here is to look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because those are clearly going to be really important for business schools, and it's going to be possibly the metric. Like one of the examples that we were talking about is one of our colleagues at Stanford was told that they are in her business school tracking every single faculty activity to the UN development standards. So that what we're seeing is that document is being operationalized, which is great news for Europeans, because Europeans are way ahead of Americans in terms of using those as sustainable goals. So that's going to be good news moving forward. We also are focused on what we can do as a profession. And this presentation is a wonderful example of how we can continue to work with different business schools across the United States, across not just the United States, but the world. So one of the things that we haven't done in the past is look at, all right, we know what business librarians look like in the US. How do they look in Greece? How do they look in Europe? You know, what can we learn in terms of different types of resources that maybe are important in other places, including the global South or non-English speaking schools. So for example, how does a library need to look different in Indonesia than it does in Indiana, right? We also want to include small universities, as well as focusing on speaking the language of AACSB. And we found that AACSB has responded really positively to librarians' excitement. We've met a couple of times now with different AACSB partners, and they are very excited to find out that we're not only listening, but we're using the same terminology. So that is kind of the end of all of our information. I'm just going to reiterate that we did a retrospective of the libraries in the standards, so you can get a better idea of what is happening currently in the standards and how that relates to previous standards and how that can be really important. We gave an overview of the drafting process. So what it looked like to make it. We did this specifically because in 10 years, it's going to happen again. So having an idea for how it looks can help us anticipate it. And then we also looked at the implications of the 2020 new standards and the 2021 revision, which has that really high focus on societal impact. And we've also focused a little bit on what we think librarians should do well. We also have written a paper on this topic, which we will put in the chat, that is open access. So this includes a lot of what we've talked about pre-2021 revision. So this was written after the 2022 standards. So if you're looking for more information or for something to cite to learn more, you can check out that presentation, that paper that we've written on the topic as well. And I just want to thank you all for giving some of your Friday night to listening to us talk about one of our favorite topics, which is AACSB. I just want to thank my co-presenter, LuMarie. We've worked on this paper together for about 2 years now, and it's been a delight. So I'm happy to take any questions at this point, as well as find out what you guys think and what you're thinking about.
Okay, thank you so much, both of you. So are there any questions from participants to our speakers? Does anybody want to address a question or say something on this? No? Okay, in this case, I have a question for both of you. One question regarding libraries and standards. Well, in your opinion, you said that in 2020 revision, there was how can I say that? My question is, what made the association to revise references regarding libraries and include libraries and library support back in the standards of 2020? Are you aware of the forces that made this to happen? Can you understand the question?
Yes, and actually, I'm very glad you asked this question because this is actually very interesting. We, in the first draft that came out of the 2020 standards, libraries were not mentioned. And at various points during the feedback period, there was a librarian in Washington, D.C. who reached out to AACSB with feedback and hopes and language for incorporation of libraries into the standards. Additionally, Ilana reached out during one of the feedback periods to request a meeting with AACSB and describe the work that we were doing as a review of the standards, a historical retrospective from the perspective of librarians. Those are the 2 points of contact that we're aware of. And after that happened, the next draft that came out mentioned the libraries in multiple places. So we're not sure if there were other influences that occurred that we're not aware of, but those are 2 instances that we know happened in between the 2 drafts.
That's so interesting. What gives inspiration of what we can achieve if we're alert. Okay, yeah. I have another one regarding universities and business schools. Can you give us some reasons why a business school should seek for accreditation? I mean, in Greece, we're not very much familiar with this, let's say, concept. Can you give us some reason? Is it the reputation the business school achieve? Is it the competitive advantage? Is it something else?
Yeah, I think it is a competitive advantage. So part of this is like prestige. So business schools specifically like to be accredited in order to say, like, you know, we're recognized by AACSB, which, as they say on their websites, accredits the top business schools in the world. Additionally, there are some things that come with this. So, for example, some conferences. I will say that AACSB, at least in the US, is the main professional association for business school deans. So if you're a dean of a business school or a director of a business school, you would probably want to be part of AACSB because that is the place where all the prestigious deans hang out. So I could see a school seeking accreditation for those reasons as well. So prestige, but also that collegiality of administrators, particularly. Those are who kind of get together in those cases. I don't know, LuMarie, can you think of anything else in terms of that?
I think that, you know, a lot of the arguments that I would say kind of go back to prestige. So the idea of being able to argue that you have a curriculum that's upholding international standards. I think it's useful for, I used to work at a much smaller university than I do now, and they were AACSB accredited. So it was very useful for them to say that their degree had the same accreditation as a much larger school, such as the University of Michigan or, you know, Harvard or NYU, a more prestigious school. So in that respect, it was a great interest, especially for schools that were smaller or less prestigious. I think that in terms of the networking effects, that's something that you can take advantage of as an educational member. So if you don't want to go through the accreditation process immediately, a good first step, and this is, I think, what many institutions do, is they start off by being educational members, kind of learning the environment and learning what would be required if they did go up for accreditation.
Okay. Thank you so much, both of you. Are there any participant that wants to address a question to our speakers? It seems that we don't have any other questions, so I have to thank both of you for the informative presentation. For me, it was like a guidance of what a library should seek for being more for advancement, for enhancement of the library of the library services they give. Anthi, you have a question, or you have something to say?
Yes, I'd like to thank so much LuMarie and Ilana for this valuable presentation. And it is a challenge for Greek libraries and Greek economic libraries to try to find their way and a new way to for this evidence-based work they must present. Thank you very much.
It was really inspiring. Thank you so much, both of you.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting us. And I tried to put our emails in the chat. So if you have any questions about any of this, or you need us, or if you need any access to any more materials or guidance, please let us know, because we are very interested in sharing this information with other librarians moving forward.
You gave us a lot of stuff
thank you for your time today.
You gave us a lot of stuff to study, so yes, we'll keep in touch. And we're glad to have you in the next meeting, perhaps, of our network. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both you guys. Bye-bye.